Hello, everyone. Today, our guest is Vijay Karunamurthy, Field Chief Technology Officer at Scale AI. In this conversation, we discuss AI as a tool with profound ethical implications. How do we ensure AI benefits humanity? What role does testing and evaluation play in responsible AI development? Join us as we tackle these questions and more, offering insights into the responsibilities and exciting possibilities that come with AI innovation. Hi, Vijay. So happy to have you on today. Where are you dialing in from today?
Hi, Emma. Thank you for having me. I am dialing in from Scale AI's office in San Francisco, really at the heart of everything that's happening in AI. So couldn't be more happy to be here and excited to chat with you.
Yeah, a lot of us MBAs aspire to move to SF after graduation, including myself. But to start with, in simple terms, could you explain Scale AI to us and what your role is?
Absolutely. So Scale AI is really at the heart of what's happening with the generative AI revolution today. And really the core product we have that's made an impact on a lot of what you're seeing with generative AI is our data engine. So people may not realize it, but a lot of the AI revolution that's happened has really been built around data, having access to really high quality data that can be used to train the models, and using that data to have models actually do things that are useful to human beings. Not just give any answer to a question, but give like a really accurate, thorough answer that helps a college student do better on a chemistry exam, or that can help someone write a poem or a song or get inspiration for something they want to do creatively. Data is actually a key piece of how these models are trained and how we make them actually useful for human beings. So we pioneered with the data engine an approach to training AI models and to helping them do work that's in service of human beings, and then going beyond that and actually measuring how the models do and finding additional areas to improve those models. So our data engine's been used by many of the model providers that are out there. If you use, a large language model or a Gen AI model, pretty likely we're involved at some level of either how the model was trained or how the model was evaluated and put to use within a Fortune 500 company or other folks that are using generative AI today. We also do a lot of great work with government partners, including the US government, the Biden-Harris administration with their executive order. We have a really important story to tell when it comes to AI and regulation, which is that we should be starting by testing and evaluating the models first, regardless of whether you care about how the models are capable of taking on tasks they weren't before, or whether you're concerned about safety and risks that those models have as the models become more powerful. It's important to start with a grounded perspective on what the models are capable of doing. And we think testing and evaluation is an important piece of that puzzle. So we pioneered some of the best test and evaluation platform capabilities in the industry. And we really work across all the different model providers that are out there. So we're not just tied to one particular Gen AI model. We're able to test and evaluate all the different models in lots of different configurations and state this model may be capable of doing this task. Maybe it's writing code, maybe it's aiding with mapping data, and this model has these safety risks that you need to be aware of so that folks that are implementing these models or that are thinking about regulation, they can understand what the safety and harm characteristics are.
Awesome. That's a great overview. I would love to dive a little bit deeper and give our listeners a better understanding of what test and evaluation really means. Could you walk us through an example, like exciting project you've done recently and show us or tell us the concrete steps that this requires?
Yeah, definitely. So we were really excited to get to partner with a few folks in the federal government, but one really interesting area that we've delved into has been with the Department of Defense. And they have a unit called CDAO, which is the Center for Data and Analytics, that's really focused on the chief kind of digital perspective on how this generative AI technology can be used across a variety of different groups within the Defense Department. One of the challenges they have is that using AI in a defense context means you need to be really aware of what the accuracy of the models are given tasks before you assign them to mission critical tasks. If you're going to ask an AI model to go and send a drone to go survey a scene in a city, you want to make sure the model is actually capable of understanding what's happening on the ground. How do I get the drone to that location? What are the risks that the drone may not have enough capacity, whether it's fuel or logistically able to get there? All of those areas where the model needs to be aware of the context in which it's operating, and it being really important to test and evaluate before you trust that model to take on a mission critical task. So we've pioneered some of the ways where we think about real world examples of how generative AI is being used today on the ground, whether it's by analysts, whether it's by folks that are working, in the field and in conflict areas, and finding ways to actually test how the models perform in those real scenarios. That ends up being really important because there are all sorts of ways you could potentially test a model. You could create really simple tests that say whether the model is able to answer questions correctly. You could create pretty complicated examples using other models to make those examples. But ultimately, the real test of whether these models work is real world examples of how they're going to be used and seeing whether models can actually be brought to mission critical tasks. So that partnership's been really important to us. We think this is an important piece of how generative AI is going to be adopted by the Defense Department, starting with testing and evaluation, and then finding opportunities to improve the accuracy and the reliability of the models so that when a service member uses it, they feel like they understand what the technology is, how they're using it, what the limitations of it are, and they can use it more reliably in their day-to-day work.
For the drone example, does that mean that you're actually creating a test physical environment for it to go and survey and just repeating that? Or is it a digital environment and testing the accuracy? Or what is that part of the project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for testing generative AI models, it's important to have a digital environment that the models can operate in. We think about ways where we can combine human insight together with ML models that are able to think about the world around them and to really expand the scope of what humans can do. So a great example of that might be looking at the use of a model to detect suspicious activity in a chat transcript. There might be human experts, let's say legal or compliance experts, that understand what suspicious activity looks like and what you should be looking for as an analyst when you're going through, let's say a 10,000 page chat transcript or something that's happening over many months and try to figure out like what's that one moment where something really suspicious happened there, maybe something that reveals criminal activity or something that reveals fraud. That legal experts or compliance experts' guidance and feedback is incredibly important to think about how you could build that into a testing scenario so that you can evaluate whether the model could actually go about reliably finding examples of fraud or criminal activity across potentially thousands or tens of thousands of chat transcripts. But there's also an element where models can help us construct a model of the world and build more reliable tests. And so we aid the human beings. We do what's called hybrid evaluation, where it's both humans sharing their perspective and giving examples and feedback to the model on how to go about testing those models, and then having models themselves augment that and make that much more capable. So you get a much more robust perspective on what the model is capable of doing and where it might fall apart, where it might have limitations in understanding the world, understanding human conversations, understanding mapping data, all sorts of areas where the models are continuously improving, but we need to know what the limits are today.
Thinking about what you've said from just maybe the average AI user, I feel that most of what we've interacted with, or many people interact with, is like ChatGPT or Claude or what have you. And they can't seem to always be reliable even for basic math questions. How far off are we really from being able to reliably use AI for fraud detection and for military use? And what sort of problems and technologies is Scale working on to help advance that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's important, kind of bit of insight about these models. There are certain tasks where the models are very capable of generating really creative, nuanced answers. Some tasks where you can ask the model to walk step by step and think through a problem and give really just accurate reasoning about how each step of the problem could be solved. There are other examples like doing basic math where just asking the model to do a basic math problem, you're probably going to get a wrong answer. And it's kind of surprising when you see that. You think, oh, this is an incredibly capable artificial intelligence and it can't solve, 350 plus 670. I don't know a good example, but usually those three-digit numbers are often where they start falling apart. It's important to use testing and evaluation to understand what the model is capable of doing and where it's going to run into real limitations. That's true regardless of whether you're using it for a mission critical example or you're a Fortune 500 company and you're trying to use this in order to aid your workforce and help them do their job better. You want to know what's the scope and boundaries in which the models should be used, and really what are the opportunities to help improve the model, whether that's building an application architecture around the model that helps make it more reliable. Even the example of doing three-digit arithmetic, if you can build an application where the model knows to go call a calculator and can actually ask that calculator to add those three numbers for it and then get the answer back and give that back to a human operator, that model suddenly is 100% reliable. If you can just let it know, like, hey, every time you need to do arithmetic, you should be calling a calculator. You shouldn't be trying to do this by yourself, which is something human beings kind of know as well. Like if you ask me to do a 7-digit number plus 7-digit number, I'm going to throw my hands up and say, I should probably just enter that into a calculator to do that. So helping the models know what are the opportunities for them to leverage tools, leverage different approaches to use all of this insight about the world around them is an important piece of how we're gaining new capabilities in the models. But each time we do that, it's important to test that the model is able to do that reliably. It's not just enough to tell the model, hey, you could go use this calculator. Instead, you need to be testing and evaluating. Does the model do that reliably? Does it get the right answer? Does it know how to communicate that to a human, or does it know how to use that for the next step of the problem that's trying to solve? And really just helping the model understand, hey, you've gotten pretty good at using this calculator, but there are a few cases where you really didn't understand what you were doing when you were using that. Improving that feedback feedback cycle so the model can see how to use those tools better is the next piece of what we do as well.
So when you're doing test and evaluation, are you looking for 70% accuracy, 100% accuracy? I assume it depends a lot on the client.
Yeah, it depends a lot on the use case and often how mission critical this objective is. For something like getting a drone to a location, a conflict zone, you need to be pretty close to 100% accurate. And you probably need multiple checks and balances to make sure you're doing the right thing when an analyst is being tasked to do that. In other examples, the fraud detection case, even if you're able to surface a significant amount of potential fraud that could appear in a large number of chat transcripts, that might actually be really useful and really insightful for an organization to try to track early instances and get ahead of problems that might happen, especially with like financial transactions. If you're able to do that at 70% accuracy, that's actually a great start in uncovering the areas which might be of real concern to the government or to a bank or to anyone that's looking at security related information. So it depends on the use case. And we often think about this matrix of thinking about the use and the different levels of risks that are associated with that use, which you're starting to see a lot of regulators around the world think about this as well. For example, in the EU, they just passed this AI Act yesterday. And one of the key features of that act is thinking about a taxonomy of different harms that could come about with the use of AI. At the very high level of risk are those that involve law enforcement or involve potentially profiling individuals and having consequences. At the lower level of risks are things that maybe just empower day-to-day operations, help people do their work better, but where there's always a human in the loop that's going to be correcting what the model does. So we talk to all of our customers and we ask them to think about that taxonomy and how they're using AI, and then really hone in on test and evaluation for some of the highest risk use cases first, and then think about ways where test and evaluation can aid the lower risk cases and help them understand what the capabilities are too.
So these taxonomies outlining different harms that AI can do may seem detailed to some, but I feel like applying them is actually very difficult and very subjective. How do you and how does Scale help concretely translate those, and what role are you helping to play in thinking about ethics in AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're talking to a lot of customers that are thinking deeply about this, definitely over the last 6 months. I would say 2 years ago, if you talked to a customer and you asked, do you have a chief AI ethics officer? They would probably look at you with a completely blank face. So they'd say, what is that job? I've never heard of that job before. But now if you talk to like any big bank or insurance company, all of them are thinking through these like different roles and responsibilities for the organization to make responsible AI work. Some of that really starts at the top, like within the C-suite. Do you have folks that understand what are the real risks about deploying AI? How can I do about doing that reliably? And what are the realistic timelines for deploying generative AI within the organization, given everyone within that organization, outside organization is concerned about the impact of AI and is concerned about how these businesses are going to be transformed by AI. So those organizations are thinking deeply about that. It's important for them to figure out where did those folks sit within the organization? How can CEOs and others that are ultimately accountable for how the business is transformed have the right conversations about AI? The great thing about Scale is that we built this platform called the Scale Generative AI Platform that's able to help those folks, those that are entrusted with figuring out the responsible deployment of AI, look across the entire organization and get a perspective on what testing is in place. What accuracy levels am I seeing for all these different applications? Have I leveraged opportunities to maybe fine tune the model so that it's more accurately able to give answers in Japanese and Korean if I'm a multinational company and I realize some of my customers are in other countries where English isn't really the language that they're going to be asked the models to speak in, instead it's some other language. Do I know about the risks associated with these models? Maybe it could be cybersecurity risks. Maybe I'm concerned about ransomware attacks if I'm an insurance company and I want to make sure that as I deploy Gen AI, I'm not exposing myself to those sort of attacks. We've built the Gen AI platform to assess this across all the different ways in which people could be using generative AI. And we're hopeful that the right decision makers with the company are empowered to use this platform to get the right perspective across the organization, and then use that to go tell the C-suite, the board directors that are asking, when am I going to see the outcomes of these Gen AI launches? Hey, this is the right timeline. This is the responsible deployment that we're achieving.
Generally, are we seeing people wanting to deploy models before 100% accuracy and trying to rely more on the testing it out and continuing to refine it, or people tending to be more hesitant and waiting for things to be perfect? I'm just curious how quickly and how robustly people are testing things generally.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would frame it a little bit differently. And I would say where we're seeing generative AI have the earliest impact is where you're aiding a human being that understands this domain really well to do their job better. But ultimately, it's the human that's making the decision about whether to trust the AI output or whether to ask further questions there. A great example of some of the early adoption we're seeing is helping data analysts do data inquiries better. Oftentimes, those data analysts have to write a pretty complicated language called SQL when they're querying a database. SQL doesn't look like English. It doesn't look like the ways we do. It's like its own kind of way of thinking about data and how you ask questions of data. But in the past, it's always been data analysts have been the only people in the organization that could effectively write the SQL and query a database and get that information back. We're starting to see in the early days, these models can help those analysts write better SQL than they could before, or give them more insights into the data than they would have thought of getting on themselves. For example, they could say, hey, if you're looking for information about the number of people that bought this product in the Midwest region in the last month, here are 3 other things you can ask to account for weather patterns that maybe stop people from going to the store to buy that product. Or maybe here are ways where you can account for the fact that people buy this product on Monday through Friday, but they don't buy on Saturday, Sunday. The ML model can actually help the data analyst, maybe that has been doing this job for like 5 years or 6 years, understand the sort of insights that would take decades of working with this data to understand these sort of patterns and figure out what sort of questions you could be asking. But ultimately, it's that data analyst that looks at this SQL and says, hey, this is the right way to execute this, or this is the sort of follow-up questions I need to be asking. So they're really aided by the ML model rather than just trusting that. We're seeing a lot of early adoption where that's the case. There's a human expert that's in the loop somewhere there, and the human expert can give feedback and state, hey, this model didn't do a great job in that case. This is maybe a reason why, and we could go back in and improve the model with fine-tuning to help it get more accurate answers in the future.
I think a lot of what people continue to fear about AI and some of these models is embedded societal issues like racism, sexism, et cetera. And so it's how far off do you think we are from not having a human in a loop? And would you advocate for continuing to have a human in a loop to prevent that? Or have you worked on models to like test out racism, that kind of stuff? I'm just, curious about how much those types of ethics are playing a role in how this is being developed now.
Yeah, bias in general is an incredibly important topic right now, and one that's top of mind for a lot of our enterprise customers, a lot of our government partners. It's really a key part of how we built out this testing and evaluation product, is trying to figure out ways where you can test examples of bias in the model output, and then really get into the details of figuring out where that bias is coming from or what could be changed in the future to make that happen. Some of the bias that you're seeing in the model outputs is just as a result of how the models were trained. They were pre-trained on all of this data that was gathered from the open internet, which could be Reddit posts or social media posts. And so all the bias that's you've seen out there, as well as like some really malicious statements like hate speech, might have been present in that pre-training data. And so the model ultimately is informed by that pattern of thinking and the sort of outputs that it gains. So knowing that that's a problem with how the models were trained when they were initially created, we spent a lot of time thinking about what can you do next? What can you do in the post-training part of the cycle where you have this base model and now you can adapt it to make it more useful to human beings? And so a lot of what we've done over the last 2 years really started with work we did with OpenAI before ChatGPT was launched. We were the data provider for this approach called reinforcement learning with human feedback. And it's a complicated term, but it really stands for the idea that human beings can give feedback to the model and help the model understand instances where it's biased or instances where it has harmful output so that the model can improve in the future and actually do a better job of answering questions more accurately or without the bias that's present there. It's become a really important technique for any one of these large language models or large generative AI models to get released, is thinking through from a responsible AI perspective, how can I think through instances where the model maybe has malicious outputs or outputs that are going to lead to harms for the user that's asking the model those questions. For example, I have a daughter that uses generative AI. I'm always really concerned if the model is going to give, a gendered answer that maybe is related to something she's really excited about, or, it's talking about a historical context and it doesn't quite frame the fact that, hey, that's the way in which things worked, 1,000 years ago, but they don't quite work that way today. So we really think testing and evaluating how models do on all these different scenarios becomes an incredibly important part of responsibly releasing models. And then think about techniques like RLHF, ways where we can mitigate those harms, is going to be an important part of the story definitely for the next couple of years and probably, for the foreseeable future of us using this technology.
Regarding some of these like larger models like ChatGPT, how often do they really engage in testing and evaluation? Is this a daily thing? I mean, taking hate speech, for example, unfortunately, people are extremely creative and things need constant updating. So how often is that happening?
Yeah, for a lot of the model providers that are investing, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in training the next generation models, this is a 24/7 thing that they're thinking about. The models are constantly being trained. Even when a researcher goes to sleep, the model's often being trained overnight. From that same perspective, they're doing testing and evaluation all the time. So 24/7, the models are being tested. They're constantly trying to find new blind spots and how they can understand how the model performs. Some of those tests can take a long time to run, so they're constantly running them and running through batches of tests. And additionally, the techniques that we use in order to fix problems with the models, like reinforcement learning with human feedback, they're constantly going through these feedback cycles where the models get better, and then we identify new blind spots, and then we continuously improve and give more data that can help the model understand how to fix those blind spots. Ultimately, it's this process of just getting better quality curated data to help train these models, of which as the models get more sophisticated and more capable, you need better quality data in order to make the models understand what patterns of behavior we expect out of them. And we've seen, over the last couple of years that the models have started to get so sophisticated that they, to some extent, understand when they're being tested. Like they know that you're doing something or ask them a question that seems a little bit fake or contrived, and they might actually bias their answer on the fact that they think they're being tested. There's a great example we just saw like a few weeks ago with the new Anthropic models that came out, where a researcher at Anthropic asked the model to find a statement in a really long set of documents. And the model went and found the right statement. It was a statement about what pizza toppings were everyone's favorite pizza toppings. But said the fact that you asked for this really weird sentence in the middle of a long set of documents really makes me suspicious that you're either playing a joke on me or you're trying to test me as an AI model. And so I'm going to give you the answer, but I also think there are probably better ways you could be testing me. That statement is really just kind of it's mind-bending to think the models realize that they're in the middle of being evaluated and they know that, and they can twist their answer a little bit slightly to make you as a researcher believe you're getting the accurate answer. But it also highlights the fact that we're constantly trying to find better real-world examples of testing and making sure that the models are being tested on things that really matter to human beings, so that if the model is biased in output, it's biased in a way that's favorable to the way real-world users are going to use the model.
Two follow-ups to that. I guess the first is, how do you develop what it actually means to be not harmful to people, since people have different views of that, especially when it comes to things such as free speech?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the key principles we have with our testing and evaluation platform is the need to understand how diverse your data set is. And diversity can mean a variety of things. It can mean you're asking lots of different questions of the model and evaluating how the model does on a range of different questions. So it's not enough to just ask the model to write emails for me. Instead, you need to test, can the model, actually generate poetry? Can it generate creative tasks? Can it execute on multiple choice questions if you want the model to answer SAT or ACT questions in the future? Can it do those sort of things reliably as well? So we have a range of different ways we think about how diverse the training data was that was used to train the model, and then how diverse are the tasks that we're evaluating it on are. Once you understand that perspective diversity, you can then get into the gritty of like different human perspectives on different tests and what that means for testing and evaluating the model. And we built this platform to enable a huge range of people from different backgrounds to help inform the tests that are being used to evaluate the models. So in some cases, we're looking for people with really specific experiences, people that have PhDs in biology or chemistry that can help evaluate whether the model gives an accurate answer to help an undergrad student understand biology better. In other cases, we're looking for people with legal or compliance backgrounds to help the model give more accurate legal answers. In other cases, we're just looking for people with different cultural awareness to come in. If you're going to have a model that's going to give outputs in Japanese or Korean, it's not enough to just rely upon English speakers to evaluate whether that model is giving accurate answers. You really do need people that speak Japanese, speak Korean, have lived in Japan or Korea, that understand the cultural context of how those questions might be asked. And so we go about finding the right people with the right cultural backgrounds to inform that. Ultimately, it's up to the model providers and those that are deploying models to kind of take a responsible approach and ensure that they're measuring the amount of diversity, the amount of quality that goes into this data. But we built the platform to give them that right perspective and help them make an informed decision about whether the model should be used in a given context or whether it should be limited to a restricted set of context.
Well, that's so interesting. So part of your job is technology and data, but part of it's also just finding the right humans and bringing in a lot of different inputs.
Yeah. Sometimes it gets very specific. We find people that can speak ancient Japanese poetry and give the model feedback on like, hey, that's not the way people would talk about, this topic in 16th century Japan. But having that perspective ends up being incredibly important if that's what a college student in Japan is going to ask the model to do. And you realize, hey, the model actually doesn't have the right context to understand why it's being asked to do that.
Wow. I always just, I guess a lot of people have the idea of AI development as being a little, not cold-hearted, but clinical. And so bringing in these other humans is great. My second follow-up was just, how big of a concern do you think it would be that you would have, all these like large models are very diligent in testing and evaluating and thinking about ethics. How many people out there are using AI and just not thinking about ethics and ethical development at all?
Yeah, definitely of our customers, we haven't seen that. They come to us in part because they care about testing first and they care about having a data-driven approach to understanding how the models perform. And they care about what happens next. How do I actually resolve these issues when I come about finding them through testing? So we haven't seen that from the folks we talk to. We also haven't seen it on the government side as well. We don't think on the government partners that we work with, folks are just plowing ahead using generative AI without understanding the real implications there. Instead, we talk to folks that have a really nuanced perspective. They understand this is an incredibly powerful technology. They know that they need to be evaluating its usage, but they want to look at what the real risks are and how they can mitigate those risks before they deploy a model safely. Where I'd say, we do have concerns about, we do think, we play a key role in democratic governments using generative AI, with these mindful considerations. Outside the world of democratic governments, there's obviously a lot of advancements happening in AI as well that we don't have as much visibility into. So our founder, Alex Wangy, sometimes talk about this concept of AI overmatch, the fact that if there's a competition to build AI, we kind of need to be ahead of all these other players that could potentially be building AI models in the future. And that whoever makes the advancement first gets a better perspective on what these models are capable of, but also gets a perspective on what the risks of those models are. And so if we are in kind of this AI arms race today, it's incumbent on us, all of us that live in democratic societies, to try to push forward and understand how we can do this safely and responsibly and kind of lead the way forward for the rest of the world.
Along those lines, a lot of people are maybe, I have a background in aerospace and defense, so maybe I understand a little better than the average person, but afraid that the US is just going to take humans out of the loop. And that's not really the reality of the situation. How do you see the US government developing its ethical AI policies, and what, if any, role is Scale playing in helping, especially the DoD, develop these policies?
Yeah, we definitely don't see that being the situation as well. And you can see with our partnership with CDAO that we announced, there's a really responsible approach that folks in the government are taking about the adoption of generative AI. They're really trying to be informed by data. Did we evaluate how this model performed in real world scenarios? Do we document how that evaluation maybe fell apart in certain areas? Can we use that to inform limitations on how this AI should be used in the future? Maybe you should tell the operator, hey, in this specific scenario, you shouldn't be relying upon the AI output. You should be trusting your own judgment instead. We see that really kind of nuanced perspective coming out of the government. I think in part because you can't use this technology for more than 10 minutes without seeing, hey, this is incredibly powerful and it's an incredibly useful creative tool. And yet there are some real areas where it's never going to be 100% accurate. The only way we're going to leverage this incredibly powerful technique to assist human beings is by understanding those limitations and understanding the situations where it can be reliably used. We see that everything that we've done has been enabling that story and enabling lawmakers and regulators to understand the ways in which these models can be tested so that they are also armed with that insight. And I think you're going to see a lot of that coming on the regulatory side as well. The Biden-Harris Act, the executive order that was passed last year, was a great starting point where it empowered a lot of agencies and obligated them to think about the responsible deployment of AI within their areas. For example, the SEC and the FDA all are obligated to kind of deploy their own approaches to testing and evaluating models that apply to companies that are under their jurisdiction. We think that's the right approach. It's not just doing testing as a one-size-fit-all solution, but having folks that understand these domains really well, that understand how a healthcare company could use AI or how a financial services company could use AI, helping them use that insight that's come from years of working with these companies and apply that to this new technology. That's a really important part of this testing story as well.
Do you expect that regulators will try to put forth really strict requirements for testing and evaluation and strict accuracy requirements depending on the use case? Or is this a case where regulation might not be able to ever keep pace with the speed of technology?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think you'll see different approaches to regulation in different areas. And we've been fortunate to work both with the US government. We also are working in the UK with the efforts over there. We attended the Bletchley Park Summit, which was one of the first kind of international meetings on AI and regulation and ethics that happened last year. It happened at the home of where the World War II code breakers, Alan Turing and his group, built the first kind of code breaking AI. So it was a really nice kind of historical connection there. So I think across the world, you're seeing people concerned about this and trying to push things forward. There may be some areas where the requirements are a lot stricter than other areas. We obviously have seen that over the years with financial services and other groups. Some jurisdictions regulate banks and financial services companies more strictly than others. But I think as the technology becomes more capable, we'll understand what's kind of the base level of testing that we need to do on safety and harms just to avoid some serious issues that happen there. I think one area where I think you're going to need a lot of strict requirements is around cybersecurity. It's really important that if you have a generative AI model and you're deploying that in a data center, that doesn't just suddenly open up your data center for any attacker to come in and take control of your systems. And it's important to have responsible disclosure where we do discover vulnerabilities. This is kind of really new technology that uses new hardware. It uses GPUs in a way that we haven't leveraged before. It sometimes has really serious requirements around data center usage. So as you deploy these models, in order to do that safely, we have to start testing them and see what are the security impacts of how the models are used. The models also now are capable of using a lot of sensitive data or proprietary data. So it's important as you have a model that maybe is going to look through healthcare data, you really understand, do I have the right access controls in place? It shouldn't have someone answering an insurance question for a customer able to access a whole range of other data about other customers that aren't on the phone with me right now. So we try to make sure that the models are also tested on whether they're audited, whether the access control is understood, so that folks can really just avoid the kind of negative impacts of opening up a security hole by the deployment of AI.
Awesome. So you mentioned Alan Turing, and we've come so far since then, and I assume we'll continue to go very far in the near future. What do you see as some major changes or major things to be excited for in the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, we're really fortunate at Scale AI to get a perspective on what the next 5 years hold, because we work with many of the folks building the future of this technology, the model providers, those that are generating the next generation models. We also work with those that are adopting those models to real-world use cases, which sometimes means the models are suddenly capable of doing things that seem like superpowers to the model providers themselves because you put them within an environment where they can do really exciting, interesting things. So from both those sides, we've gained a perspective on what's coming ahead. On the model provider side, there's definitely a lot of interesting work happening with multimodal capabilities, models that understand the world around us, that can see through eyes or hear things and understand what that means. That really adds a different perspective on the experience that we all have as a human being and helps the model understand the real world better than it could with just looking at words or language itself. For example, models can understand that looking at an image of objects on a table, which of those objects is going to break if it rolls off the table, or which of those is going to bounce if it hits the floor, and then give a really nuanced answer about how a robot arm should move in order to avoid hitting something that shouldn't hit in order to pick something up off that table. The fact that we're using generative AI to control robots with these techniques is actually it's both exciting and it creates a lot of new safety risks that we spend time thinking about as well. So I think that the multimodal side is really interesting. Multilingual also, I think, the fact that we have models that can speak really fluently in English, it doesn't leave aside the obligation to make sure the model also speaks fluently French, German, Portuguese. And we're also seeing a lot of interest in what's happening with lesser known languages. For example, languages like Zulu in South Africa. That's a really important language for speakers of that language, but it's also important from a security perspective. You don't want to have the model generating really malicious answers just because you're asking it in a language that not many people speak. Instead, all the safety kind of guarantees you've baked into the model, opportunities to improve the model on issues of bias or hate speech, you want to make sure regardless of what language you ask the model questions and it lives up to those expectations. So we see things pushing forward there. The usage of these models in the real world as well, we see a lot of excitement around agent-based architectures. So where it's not just asking the model one question and getting back one answer, but actually having a model plan step by step through a process of answering these questions. We talked a little bit about the use of calculators or other tools. At the very sophisticated extremes, these models can write code, generate that code, and then give the output back to a human user and do something no human being would be able to do on their own. So I think pushing that forward and seeing what you can do with agents is going to be a really key story for the next 5 to 10 years.
That's so exciting. I feel like no one, at least in my circle, anticipated AI moving at the speed that it has and being so useful and integral so quickly to our daily lives. I never expected to use AI on a daily basis a year and a half ago maybe. But to switch gears a little bit, since we are a podcast that a lot of people listen to thinking about careers and what they want to do, I know you have a technical background, but to the extent you could speak to opportunities in AI for those without technical backgrounds, I'd love to hear any advice you'd have for people like me that find it fascinating, but maybe aren't coders.
Yeah, we live in such an interesting time. I do have a technical background. My undergrad degree was in biochemistry, and I started writing code back then. But I actually did a minor in English literature. I was really interested in just the history of getting diverse perspectives onto paper and how you could read a story and understand what someone living in a different era or a different part of the world really experienced. Maybe just understand a little bit of different human perspectives through stories. It's become now, in the year 2024, those sort of humanities-based backgrounds become incredibly important to understanding how these models work and what they're doing and how they can be improved in the future. Because we're asking these models to do really creative, interesting tasks. problems. We're asking them to help a college student get a better answer to an organic chemistry question. But the model also needs to know, hey, if that student missed the last 3 classes because they were struggling to deal with a job that they had outside of school, these are ways where I could help that person catch up, or these are ways where I could help that person feel supported as part of this answer, instead of feeling frustrated that they missed 3 days of class and they don't understand what's happening on this problem set. That kind of human perspective on what we're asking these models to do ends up being incredibly important. We had a great partnership with a company called Chegg over the last couple of months, which has been really valuable for us to understand this. Chegg really believes that it's not just aiding college students in understanding the facts of these classes that they're taking and helping them kind of memorize those facts. It's really helping people understand how to get through college, which is really challenging in the United States. People have so many things going on in their lives, and most people will drop out of college or stop a college degree in part because of things that happen just outside of the classes that are somewhat out of their control. So we really see, as people leverage AI and they're no longer talking to a human tutor, they're talking to an AI model, it becomes even more important to have this humanities-based perspective on the right way to aid human beings and help them get through their lives and do their work better, the right way to be supportive, the right way to understand mental health issues when someone brings that up as part of a conversation. So we're seeing that being an incredibly important role to play. We often look for those sort of backgrounds when we look at folks and help these models do work better. And I think you're going to see that intersection of not just the technical perspective of what these models can do, but the human aspect of what we're asking them to help human beings do be incredibly important.
I love that. I feel like if we only continue to base future decisions on decisions and data in the past, we just perpetuate the negative things that humanity has done.
Yeah, and not understand the context in which something might have been said being a real limitation if you don't do that. So, even though these models have been trained on a wide range of what's been available on the internet, helping them understand, hey, you might have seen that on a blog post, but that actually sounds more like hate speech and not something that you should be outputting, ends up being an incredibly important perspective to give the model to help it understand how to do work more accurately, more reliably, but also with the right sort of context and perspective on the statements it's making.
And then one other career-focused question, but we also have a lot of founders, or I know a lot of founders who are thinking about integrating AI for people just trying to start businesses. What sort of advice would you give them on integrating AI and maintaining ethical practices?
Yeah, so I was a founder myself in a different era before this current era of generative AI. I started a company with Steve Chen, who's the co-founder of YouTube, and we were looking at live video and opportunities to help people experience the world through live content better than they could in the past. I think the opportunity of AI to transform how everyone experiences the world is just so enormous that we're only just getting our heads around it. And the number of opportunities to start a startup and leverage this technology and really just change people's perspective on the world around them is so huge that I think it's an amazing time to start a startup. It's an amazing time to think through problems. And maybe, just kind of related to the previous answer, having a human perspective on how people are using AI as a founder ends up being incredibly important so that you're building stuff that's actually useful instead of just something that's solving a problem that maybe only one person has, or that is a really deep, technical, interesting problem, but doesn't actually make these models do something useful for human beings. So I think founders that are able to really talk to customers, understand what they hope to achieve with AI, understand how to leverage this technology to do that work better, they're going to be the ones that have a leg up on everyone else, and they're going to be seeing the future forward. We're fortunate at Scale to get to partner with a lot of them. We're also kind of fortunate to work with those building the future of this technology. I think it's a really interesting time for everyone to kind of come together and see these opportunities forward.
Well, that's a very optimistic note, I think, and a good place to end our episode. Thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you, Emma. This is a great discussion, and hopefully we don't look back on this 5 years from now and feel embarrassed by how little we knew about AI. Instead, we were excited that we were at the right path all along.
Well, I hope we feel at least a little embarrassed since hopefully we've progressed so far, but regardless, very exciting.
Perfect. Thank you so much.